How you doing, guys? Today I am working on the Clinton some more. I have been kind of picking at this on and off for the last couple days because I'm trying to get it done. As you know, what I've done since the last time we've met is I have actually installed the bearing plate and the crankshaft. Not a lot of specialty actions needed to do this. It's just making sure that when you put the bearing plate on, you have the proper end clearance or end play of the crankshaft. With these motors, sometimes it could be a little difficult setting the crankshaft end play on the basis that the bearing plates are always warped. The 4 bolts that hold the bearing plate on, it's not very robust. There's this little support ridge right here. There is a kind of a support ridge here, and then there's an embossment that the bolt actually sits on. But because these tend to need 1, maybe 2 gaskets to get the correct end play for the crankshaft, you got to be really careful that you torque it correctly. Now, if the motor had ever been taken apart, I can guarantee you that the bearing plate is warped like this around the bolts. So in other words, the bolts are low and the centers between the bolts are high. And that's what was wrong with this bearing plate. There's really no way of straightening it out, at least no way I know of. It's pretty brittle aluminum. It's not the greatest quality in the world. As I've probably said in the past, Clinton really did have some quality issues. They had a good design, but quality issues in general. So in order to get this crankshaft to have the proper end play, or as close as possible, I had to run 2 gaskets, bearing plate gaskets, to get it right. So lined up the timing marks, the dot on the camshaft gear and the dot on the crank gear, lined them up so they're dead nuts. Installs the crank, and then I just test fit a couple times the bearing plate with 1 gasket. The crank was real tight, was bound up. Took it apart, put 2 gaskets in. I didn't torque it, I just made it snug because I knew that once I torqued it, it would suck it in, or suck the bearing plate in a little bit. Plus it can damage the gaskets by torquing them in and then taking it apart if you have to. So I snugged them down, and then I checked the end play of the crank. It was just a couple thousandths big, so I knew that once I torqued the plate into place, it would be fine, and that's exactly what it happens. So I have the crank timed with the camshaft, the 2 gaskets for the proper clearance, and then according to the little Clinton paperwork I have, 140 inch-pounds the bolts were torqued to, and I have a little baby inch-pound torque bar style torque wrench, which is more than acceptable for the bearing plate. You want to kind of use a micrometer style torque wrench to do the head, but now that crank spins real nice. I don't think you can hear it, but there's just a hair of end play in the crank, so that is all set to go. And that leads us to the next step, which is to put the piston and the rod in the motor. Oh, almost forgot to tell you or mention, if you didn't know, the seal for a Clinton 1200 or 1290, okay, for the flywheel end of the crankshaft, you have to install that from the inside. So what that means is, before you put the bearing plate on and torque it all into place, you have to press the seal, the crankshaft flywheel end seal, into the bearing plate from the inside. If you forget to do that and try to put the seal in through this way, ain't happening. You're gonna have to take the whole thing apart in order to put the seal in. It is probably one of the stupidest designs on the face of the planet. Because over the course of time, these seals can go on any motor. You actually have to take the bearing plate off the block, screw up the gaskets, in order to do the seal, because you have to press the seal from this direction. So you got to take it off, press it out, press it back in, and then put the bearing plate back on. Completely stupid, but just keep that in mind if you work on one of these motors. The seal has to go on first. So again, just so I'm clear, because I forgot this, time the crank to the cam, install it, put your seal in the bearing plate, put your gaskets on the bearing plate, put the bearing plate on the block, torque to 140 inch-pounds, and do it in a crisscross pattern. And then check it. Make sure this crank spins nice and smooth. It's not tight. It doesn't have any chatter. And this thing, it's in real good shape. It's perfect. It's perfect. So we shouldn't have any issues with that. Now, the next thing, the piston and the rod. The piston and the rod, this is a standard piston, new, obviously brand new, new pin, new clips, new rings. Be prepared when you find these parts or when you get them on eBay. They are dirty, you know, from just sitting around. I don't know why Clinton parts seem to be more dirty than Kohler parts when they're NOS like this, but they are. So go ahead and make sure you clean these parts really good, between the rings, all inside. I use brake cleaner and then blow it all off with an air gun really good. Make sure it's good and clean. Make sure your pin areas are nice and clean, because you don't want to have any issues with that. Next, same thing with the rod. This is a brand new rod, obviously. Clean it head to toe. You're going to have to reuse the dipper from your old engine. It does come with new bolt retainers, so when you torque the bolts in, you bend the tabs up so they bite or they touch the sides of the bolts. That keeps them from spinning. The rod does have those indicators, so you do know where the rod cap goes, because you want to make sure you keep the cap in the right orientation. I'm just going to show you one thing here that I have found with these kind of rods. I probably should have taken this off, but I wanted to show you what it looked like when it was together. This, take the bolts out, put those right there. You take the ends off. I don't know if you can see that, but I'm hoping you can. There's like these little pressed in alignment parts that align it into the rod. You can see that they machined it so that way when you put this thing together, let me make sure I'm doing it the right way. I am. It aligns the cap and then it just snaps into place, and it also keeps the cap from walking around. Not that it would. Your oil hole for your crank pin is right here. That goes towards the camshaft. That way, because the camshaft rotates in an opposite direction obviously than the crank, it splashes oil down onto the rod itself. That's it. I mean, it's pretty standard stuff. You've seen me put these engines. You've seen me put engines together. I do nothing different. Just use a poop load of assembly lube on everything. Assembly lube the roller bearings on the crank. I'll assembly lube the crank pin, the wrist pin, the inside of all the wrist pin areas. This will get coated in 30 weight oil, like ridiculously. And then I have a little Briggs & Stratton ring compressor that's perfect for these little engines. Just crimp it and then just don't beat the crap out of it, but get it there and boop, and push it down with a rubber mallet. That's all I do. Drop it in, line up your crank. Again, tons of assembly lube on that. Torque the bolts to specification, which is, let me see what the rod is, of course I can't find it. Head bolts, end cover, blower, flywheel, stator plate. Oh, connecting rod, aluminum. This says, Clinton says 70 to 80 inch-pounds. So I'll probably use my little bar torque wrench for that because it's small. My micrometer won't go that low. So I will just bar torque wrench those bolts into place. I put a little dab of oil on the threads just so it goes in. Torque it down, bend the tabs. You're done. And then I'll clean the base up and just Permatex the oil pan back into place. and that's it. The short block is all, or short block, long block, whatever you want to call it, is all back in place. I'll clean the flywheel, put the flywheel on. Well, I gotta put the ignition on first. I'll make a video on the ignition first before I put the flywheel. But essentially, that's it. Crank goes in, clean all your parts. I suggest that you test fit all your parts too. Make sure that the dipper fits on the rod end. I've seen that before, that they didn't fit. Sometimes you have to clearance the dipper just a little bit in this area where it's rounded, because it doesn't quite fit the round profile of the rod, because Clinton, again, their quality was iffy at best at times. Fit it to the piston, make sure the piston fits in the bore fine, and just attention to detail. It's really what it is, and it's pretty simple. All right, guys, I hope you found that interesting. I'm going to continue to work on this little engine. Hopefully I'll have it together very shortly, and then we'll see this thing run. All right, I'll talk to you shortly. Thanks, guys. Bye.